1 Kings chapter 3. The humor that I'm referring to was a recitation to me by one of the greeters of last week's story. I used an illustration of a woman who came in the back door, and the usher said, "No, the pastor is very boring, he's not very interesting, you'll fall asleep," and she insisted on being ushered right down front. So somebody was reminding me of that, and they were saying, the pastor's kind of boring. He's not very interesting. You may fall asleep. And so then I realized that she's reciting my story to me. You have to be careful what you say. One time I was preaching, and I was talking about how cults get started. And I was saying, suppose that after preaching the gospel for 5 years, I start saying funny things like we should all start dressing in purple because it's the color of royalty and God would have us dress in purple. And I start spinning little half-truths from the scripture, and that's how cults get started. And the next Sunday when I came to church, there was a sea of purple. Because one lady who had a very sharp sense of humor had gotten on the phone and went through the congregation and organized the Sea of Purple. And so I got down front, and I'm not always completely tuned in because I'm in a little world of my own Sunday morning usually, and until I get the message delivered, because that's on my heart and in my mind. And I looked out, and there's all this purple. And I thought, this can't be a coincidence. And I was a little clueless for a minute, and then I realized it was this lady who had organized this. I didn't realize that until later. But anyway, moving on. In the denominational setting that I've served in various places over the years, I learned to do, I took seminars in teaching and put many hours into learning how to do a natural talent assessment called IDAC. And IDAC is used by secular and sacred organizations alike to help to identify if certain persons that they're considering hiring will fit in that particular job. And so so IDAC looks at things like personality. Are you a person that loves a multitude of relationships? You're the quintessential car salesman, and you're meeting and greeting everybody, and you're blowing through friends, day upon day. That's a multi-relational personality. That's about 15% of us. There's another 15% of us that are singular relational. That is, we work best when we're just by ourselves, and we don't have to have too much face time with other people, and so on. So those two are the extremes, and they're 30% of the population. The rest of us are in the 70% in the middle. And so we work best with people that we know well. And so IDAC looks at personality traits like that. It looks at the ability to do fine work with your fingers. That's a good thing for dentists to have. You want your dentist to have that gift, that he can manage fine-tuned work and so on. And these are not gifts of the Spirit. These are natural talents that we're wired with. There's a fun one called ordering of workspace. Now that's the person, and you know this person. Somebody's face will come to your mind. Ordering of workspace. This is the person who on their desk or on their counter has, if they're at work, they have their rubber bands here and their paper clips here, and they have their pens or pencils at 1 o'clock and something else at 11 o'clock, and they're very precise, and they never deviate from those norms. Their drawers are just as clean and neat. you can really mess with their minds by putting their rubber bands over here and their paper clips over here. And all you have to do to mess them up for a whole day is just switch their stuff all around. You know, and that's ordering of workspace. Now, we're looking at Solomon's wisdom. King Solomon, son of David. We're looking at the mid-900s BC, so almost 3,000 years ago. But King Solomon had wisdom. Now, we don't know if he had a natural talent for wisdom and problem solving already. He may have. But what God gave him was this massive dose of discernment and problem solving and wisdom. And so our natural talents are the ways that we're wired. And those things are influenced. Our natural talents are influenced by our environment. They're influenced by our education. They're influenced by our life's experiences. All of those things go to influence our natural inclinations. Spiritual gifts are God-given. Spiritual gifts are God-given, and our spiritual gifts are always for the purpose of enhancing His service, ministering in His kingdom in one way or another. So spiritual gifts are for God's service, and they also can be further developed and enhanced by using them. God gives them to us. They're supernatural. You have one or more spiritual gifts. I have one or more spiritual gifts. Paul told Timothy to stir up the gift that is already within him, to use it. And so those gifts become stronger by our using them in God's kingdom. And so you have natural talents, but you also have spiritual gifts if you are a Christian, and God wants us to use them. Now here's my point. When we come to the person of Solomon, Solomon may well have been naturally smart. He may have naturally had problem-solving talents that were in his makeup and part of the wiring, but God gave him a spiritual gift of wisdom. Let's look at chapter 4 of 1 Kings, at verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom. 1 Kings 4, verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt, which was considerable. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite. We'll come back to Ethan later. Wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahal. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So Solomon classified plant life long before Mendel did. He was a prolific music writer, 28 centuries before Mozart, who was a very prolific music writer and wrote volumes of music before he died at age 35. Solomon wrote thousands of proverbs 4 centuries before Confucius, who's known for his, and he cataloged the animal kingdom far beyond Darwin's cataloging. And Solomon's assumptions about the origins of life were correct. And his theories were all accurate. Possibly the most famous story about Solomon's wisdom is found in 1 Kings, the 3rd chapter. So let's go to the previous chapter and read starting at verse 16 of chapter 3. 1 Kings 3, beginning to read at verse 16. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one else in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says, 'My son is alive and your son is dead,' while that one says, 'No, your son is dead and mine is alive.' Then the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, 'Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other.' The woman, whose son was alive, was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, 'Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him.' But the other said, 'Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in 2. Then the king gave this ruling, 'Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother.' When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice." Before this story happened, there was another event, and I want you to see that event too. It's also in chapter 3, but it's in the early part. So let's go to verse 5. Solomon is a brand new king. He's mostly following the ways of the Lord, but he already has some faults that are showing up in the first couple of verses of chapter 3. But God meets him at a place called Gibeon. Verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only like a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, so God said to him, "Since you have asked for this and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do for you what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, and he realized it had been a dream. So Solomon was granted wisdom before this event with the two prostitutes. This is what Solomon had just come from. He had come from this profound meeting with God, where God met him in a dream. And in the night, God had this conversation with Solomon, and Solomon in his dream asked God for wisdom. And so, in Solomon's prayers, you see this request for wisdom. The problem we have when we need God's wisdom is that we often go off of our experience. We've done something, a particular thing, so many times in life that we don't feel any special need for a profound moment of devotion or seeking God. We're just so used to doing this thing, whatever it is, because some things just become so habitual. Things that have worked well in the past, we try to do them the same way. But we should never, ever, ever take wisdom for granted. We can thank God for our experience. We can operate out of our experience, but every day we should come to God with the expectation that I need his wisdom and discernment now. I need it today. And so whatever you do in your life, that's my advice. Do what Solomon did. He asked for wisdom first. God granted it. So this meeting with God preceded Solomon's decision about dividing the baby. It's a great story. There's two prostitutes. I'm not sure how they got to have an audience with the king, because I'm pretty sure that prostitutes didn't usually get to have audiences with kings from a historical perspective. They weren't considered high-value persons in society. They certainly had their function, but they didn't get to usually make appeals before kings. This is early in Solomon's career. And so these two women have come to Solomon. I'm not trying to devalue them. I'm just saying that's the way people looked at things. So they live in the same apartment or the same house. Each one bears a male child because they refer to sons. There is a mother who is narrating the scene to King Solomon. She is the one with the true living baby. And she sets up the scene, and she gives him particular details. She has kind of an orderly mind, and in case he thinks someone else snuck in the door, the window, or whatever, and did this switch, she says, no, we were all alone. Nobody else was present in the house with us. And so that's an important detail for Solomon to know. Then a tragic death occurs. A mother smothers her baby by falling asleep and laying on it and smothering this child. It's a terrible, tragic thing. But what is more terrible is what happens next. In her anxiety, because she has smothered her child, she gets up in the dead of night, takes the dead child, carefully puts it in the arms of the other mother, and takes her living child back to bed with her. In the morning, the mother with the living child wakes up and goes to feed her son and discovers that he's dead. And she's shocked, and that shock goes through her that we've all experienced when something very sudden and tragic has happened. And then she looks, and she looks at this child, and she studies his face, and she studies his form, and she says, "This is not my son." And then she looks at the child that her housemate is nursing, and she realizes that is her son. And so this conflict begins there at the point of this ugly switched at birth thing, or near birth. And they argue before Solomon. She tells her story, and then they argue, and it starts to get into one of those things like you see on a news program where you have opposing sides and everybody starts talking over everybody else, and it all gets very ugly. And King Solomon says, "All right, enough of this. My solution is, bring me a sword. I will just cut the child in two." There's another shock for the mother of the living son. And her maternal instinct is very strong, and she pleads with the king and says, "Don't kill the child. I would rather you give the child to her than cut him in two." And the other mother, who is already in the midst of the loss of her son, comes with an attitude of, "If I can't have him, you can't have him either. Go ahead and cut the child in two." And Solomon realizes who the true mother is. He says, "No, give the child to her. She's his mother." And so what God did for Solomon in granting him wisdom becomes evident and legendary almost immediately. And the legend of his wisdom begins to reach far and wide, not only in Israel, but in the other nations round about, as Solomon's ruse has rewarded itself by indicating which child really belongs to which mother. So my question today for you is this: which impossible dilemma do you need for God to grant you wisdom? Sometimes we have workplace choices that are difficult. Sometimes the impossible dilemmas come up over a medical decision that we must make for ourselves or for someone else. Sometimes the impossible dilemma come in the form of issues related to some intra-family squabble. Well, there's all kinds of categories of dilemma and quandaries that come to human beings. What do we do as Christians? We should pray and trust God for wisdom first. Now, there are times when you're crossing a street and a car is bearing down upon you. Probably not the best time to bow your head and pray for 5 minutes. What do? You jump out of the way, because that's an instinct of survival. But what I'm talking about is we so often have these quandary, these dilemma that come, and they're difficult, and they even appear impossible. And we should go to God and pray and trust God for wisdom. Pray and trust. That's the combination. Pray and trust. Then, having prayed and having trusted, we should relax a little bit, and in our trust in the Almighty, expect Him to keep the promise He made to us in James chapter 1 through the Lord's half-brother regarding the giving of wisdom for life's issues when we ask Him. Trust Him for that. James 1:5 says, "If any of you lack wisdom, ask God, who will give it to you." And then so many people beat themselves up with verses 6 and 7. because they go on to say we should trust God and not have any doubts, because if we have any doubts, we're, like shifting sand and so on. And so we say to ourselves, well, I won't really get the wisdom because I have some doubt. God is very gracious. Look at Jesus Christ in the Gospels. People that admitted they had doubt and reservations, he helped them. He granted them wisdom and help. He blessed them anyway. Pray for wisdom and trust God that you have it. God, who gave Solomon a massive dose of supernatural wisdom, is this day still in the business of endowing us with wisdom and discernments when we ask for them. Now, there's a little side note here that I don't quite know what to do with. A little side note in this message. Sometimes I just set them on a back burner in my brain, and sometimes I express them. I'm going to express it this morning. In this story of Solomon, there is the indication that there were, in Solomon's time, some other very wise and very specific people. They're named. And we see that in chapter 4. And we see it in chapter 31, or verse 31. Chapter 4, verse 31. It's talking about Solomon's wisdom, and it says, he was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite. And then there's 3 other guys listed who were sons of a particular man. Who is Ethan the Ezrahite? He was somebody significant, because God doesn't say anything that's pointless. So why would God put his name in there? So this is sort of an extra credit question. I will admit to you, I don't know. So if you can figure it out, write it down on a slip of paper and give it to me next Sunday when you see me, or Sunday night or Wednesday night, or at some point. What is the point of mentioning Ethan the Ezrahite? I don't have a clue. God does. Perhaps, and this is just a guess, perhaps God mentioned Ethan the Ezrahite to assure us that there were other people whom God had given either natural or supernatural wisdom, either by their innate wiring or through a supernatural means. And that scriptural sidecar may just be there to encourage us. Because if we ask for wisdom and then we're having a message about Solomon, how can we compare ourselves with Solomon's wisdom? There's never going to be anybody as smart as Solomon or as wise as Solomon. God said so. So what hope do I have? We come back to James 1, verse 5. If anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask God. And the next verses say, and he should believe. Most of us will not ever be in a dispute with another person over a live baby's ownership. Not sure if anybody else has experienced that in this room, but most of us will not ever be in a dispute with another person over a live baby's ownership. But my quandary may seem very, very big to me. And your quandary may seem enormous and daunting to you. Whatever it is, pray for wisdom, as Solomon did, and exercise faith that when you've prayed, God has kept his promise based on his integrity and is giving you direction. Then give that all to God to solve by the application of his truth and the discernments of his Spirit. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. I want to point out one more thing. If you go to the very first verses of the 3rd chapter of 1 Kings, you find that Solomon walked in all the ways that his father, King David, had walked, except that he sometimes made a sacrifice to another god. He was not perfect, nor was King David. So think of that when you hear this again. If any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to him. Ask God for wisdom and put your faith in him that he has answered your prayer. God bless his word to our hearts this morning.